The burning village is silent now, the smoke still warm. You came expecting tribute. You found vengeance. Your companions, 30 hardened Norse warriors who've raided from Northumbria to the Volga, mutter prayers to Thor as they secure the longship. This land, this Wendland, seems ripe for the taking. The settlements are scattered, the people disorganised, or so the tales claim. You've been promised silver, slaves and glory by your Jarl. The forest waits, silent and watching. You signal your men forward, axes and swords at the ready. The trees swallow you, their canopy blocking the weak morning sun. The only sounds are your footfalls on the damp earth and the occasional clink of mail. Something feels wrong. The forest is too quiet, no birds, no animals, just the mist curling around ancient trunks like serpents. The first sign comes as a low, mournful howl, not quite wolf, not quite human, echoing from somewhere ahead. Then another answers from behind. Your skin prickles. These are no ordinary wolves. "Hold," you whisper, raising your hand. The war party freezes. The forest floor shifts beneath a warrior to your right. He has time only for a startled cry before the ground gives way, sending him plummeting into a concealed pit. The sickening crunch of spikes piercing flesh rises from below, followed by strangled screams. Then they come. Figures materialise from the mist. Tall warriors with faces painted in swirling patterns of white and red. Their hair is wild, adorned with bones and feathers. Some wear wolf pelts, the animals' heads still attached and forming hoods. They move with unnatural silence, emerging from behind trees that seem too slender to hide a man. A horn blasts, deep and resonant, and suddenly the air fills with arrows. Not the random volley of desperate defenders, but a coordinated rain of death. 3 of your men fall before you can shout a warning. The arrows are tipped with something that burns, a sticky fire that clings to mail and flesh alike. Shield wall. You cry, but it's too late. They're attacking from all sides, materialising like wraiths from the mist. A massive warrior steps forward, his face obscured by a wooden mask carved with inhuman features. In one hand he holds a spear with a blade unlike any you've seen, curved and serrated. In the other, a leather cord attached to a snarling wolf that strains against its leash. Yellow eyes fixed on your throat. Your men are falling. These are not the disorganised savages you were promised. Their movements are too coordinated, their ambush too perfect. They know these woods, and worse, they knew you were coming. The masked warrior raises his spear and shouts in a language that sounds like stones grinding together. In response, more wolves emerge from the underbrush, their handlers controlling them with whistles and hand signals. These beasts move with purpose, targeting the flanks of your formation, driving your men into prepared killing zones where more warriors wait. Your shield splinters under the impact of a stone-headed club. As you stumble backward, the masked warrior is suddenly before you. Up close, his wooden face is even more terrifying. Painted symbols pulse in the filtered light, seeming to move of their own accord. He speaks, and though you don't understand the words, the meaning is clear. You don't belong here. You never will. As consciousness fades, your last thought is of the tales you'll never tell, of warnings that will never reach your homeland. How could a forgotten tribe from the east become the Vikings' worst nightmare? The truth about the Wends, the confederation of Slavic tribes that controlled the southern Baltic coast, has been buried beneath centuries of history written by their enemies. Their story is one of fierce resistance, tactical brilliance, and a cultural identity so strong it withstood the might of both Norse raiders and Christian crusaders. While Viking exploits fill our modern imagination, few remember the people who broke their power and changed the course of Northern European history. This is their story. The land of the Wends stretched along the southern Baltic coast, from the Elbe River in the west to the Oder in the east, extending inland through forests, marshes and plains. This territory, parts of modern Germany, Poland and the Baltic states, was home not to a single tribe, but to a confederation of West Slavic peoples, united by language, customs, and a fierce determination to remain free. The Obotrites controlled the western territories near the Elbe, serving as the first line of defence against Saxon expansion. The Veleti, later known as Lutici, dominated the central regions, while the Rani ruled the island of Rügen and adjacent coastal areas. Further inland, the Sorbs maintained control of the forests and highlands. Each tribe maintained its independence, while recognising their common heritage and the advantages of mutual defence. By the 8th century, when they first appear in written records, the Wends had already established a sophisticated society. Their settlements were unlike anything in Scandinavia. Circular fortified complexes called grody, singular grod, that combined defensive, religious and administrative functions. Archaeological excavations at sites like Radosh reveal wooden palisades surrounding raised platforms where wooden buildings housed the warrior elite, craftspeople and priests. The Slavs build their fortresses in circles, wrote Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, a 10th century Jewish merchant who travelled through Wendish lands. They drive thick stakes into the ground, build walls of wood and earth, and surround them with water. Within these circles they establish their homes and temples. These settlements weren't mere villages, but centres of power, trade, and religious worship. The largest could house thousands of people during times of danger, with enough supplies to withstand prolonged sieges. Unlike the Norse, who built their power on mobility and raiding, the Wends created a defensive network that turned their homeland into a fortress. Their society was hierarchical, but not feudal. A warrior aristocracy, led by princes or chieftains, kniaz, ruled each tribe, supported by a class of free warriors who owned land and participated in tribal assemblies. Below them were craftspeople, farmers, and a small class of slaves, usually captives taken in battle. Women held significant status, particularly those connected to religious practices. The Wendish religion centred on a complex pantheon of gods and spirits. Chief among them was Svantevit, the four-headed god of war and prophecy, whose main temple stood at Arkana on Rügen Island. Other important deities included Triglav, the three-headed god who ruled earth, heaven, and the underworld, Perun, god of thunder, and Jivia, goddess of life and fertility. Religious practices blended public ceremonies with private household worship. Each settlement maintained sacred groves, where priests conducted rituals, divinations, and sacrifices. These priests, both male and female, held tremendous influence, often serving as advisors to tribal leaders and interpreters of omens. When the first Norse longships appeared on Wendish shores in the late 8th century, the Vikings expected to find easy prey. What they encountered instead was a society prepared for war. The earliest Norse raids followed a familiar pattern: swift attacks on coastal settlements, the seizure of valuables and slaves, and a rapid retreat before local forces could respond. This strategy had proven devastatingly effective against the fragmented kingdoms of England, Ireland, and Francia. Against the Wends, it failed catastrophically. The Slavic Chronicle of Helmold, though written later and from a Christian perspective, preserves accounts of these early encounters. The Northmen came in their ships, thinking to plunder the land of the Slavs, as they had done elsewhere. But the Slavs had watched and learned. They met the raiders not with fear, but with fury, driving them back into the sea with great slaughter. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. At several coastal sites, layers of ash and weapon fragments date to this period. But unlike similar sites in England or Francia, these layers are followed by immediate rebuilding and fortification. The Wends didn't abandon their coastal settlements, they strengthened them. What made the Wendish response different was their organisational structure. While other European peoples relied on kings or lords to muster armies, a process that could take weeks, the Wends maintained a constant state of readiness. Each settlement had its warrior contingent, and sophisticated signal systems using hilltop beacons, drums and horn calls could rapidly spread warnings across vast territories. "When danger threatens," wrote Adam of Bremen in his 11th century chronicle, "the Slavs can assemble a great host in a single day, for they are ever prepared for war and value nothing more than their freedom." The Vikings quickly learned that raiding Wendish territory required more men and resources than they could spare. Small raiding parties were annihilated, their ships captured, and their men sacrificed to Slavic gods. Larger forces faced coordinated resistance that neutralised the Vikings' traditional advantages of surprise and mobility. A telling archaeological discovery came from a mass grave near modern Wollin, Poland. Excavated in the 1960s, it contained the remains of approximately 40 men who died violently around 850 CE. DNA analysis and isotope testing revealed them to be of Scandinavian origin, while their wounds, predominantly to the back and legs, suggested they died while fleeing. Among the grave goods were fragments of Norse weapons and jewellery, but also items of Wendish origin, suggesting the bodies had been stripped of valuable gear before burial. The Wends didn't just repel Viking attacks, they studied them. Each encounter provided lessons about Norse tactics, weapons, and weaknesses. While the Vikings relied on the terror of their reputation, the Wends developed countermeasures specifically designed to neutralise Norse advantages. By the mid-9th century, the balance of power in the Baltic had shifted. The Wends were no longer merely defending their territory, they were beginning to project power outward, conducting their own raids against Danish settlements and Norse trading posts. The hunters had become the hunted. For the first time, the seemingly invincible Vikings had met their match. The forests of Wendland were not merely terrain, they were weapons. Unlike the sparse woodlands of Scandinavia, the primeval forests of the southern Baltic coast were dense, ancient, and treacherous to outsiders. The Wends transformed these natural barriers into sophisticated defensive systems that confounded even the most experienced Norse raiders. "The Slavs make the forest itself their ally," wrote a frustrated Danish chronicler. "They know every path, every stream, every clearing. They can move through dense woodland as easily as we cross an open field, appearing and vanishing like spirits." Archaeological surveys have revealed the extent of this forest defence network. At strategic points, particularly along likely invasion routes, researchers have found evidence of defensive modifications. Trees were partially cut through and left standing, creating prepared zones that could be quickly felled to block paths or crush advancing enemies. Narrow passages were lined with concealed pits, some containing sharpened stakes, others simply deep enough to break a horse's leg or trap a man in heavy armour. But the most innovative aspect of Wendish forest defence was their use of psychological warfare. The Wends understood that the forests inspired primal fear in outsiders, a fear they deliberately amplified. Wooden effigies of their gods and ancestors were placed along forest paths, carved with threatening expressions and positioned to catch the filtered sunlight in unsettling ways. Skulls, both animal and human, adorned trees at irregular intervals. Wind-activated noisemakers created eerie sounds that seemed to follow intruders. These psychological tactics were especially effective against Norse raiders, whose own mythology was filled with forest spirits and creatures. "They hang the heads of their enemies from the trees," reported Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, "not merely as trophies, but as warnings and offerings to their gods. They believe these heads continue to watch and will alert them to danger." The swamps and marshlands that dotted Wendish territory formed another layer of defence. While seemingly impassable to outsiders, these wetlands contained hidden causeways and paths known only to local guides. Wendish warriors could rapidly deploy through areas that would swallow pursuing enemies. During winter, when frozen marshes might otherwise allow easier passage, the Wends developed techniques for breaking ice in strategic locations, creating deadly traps for unwary invaders. At the heart of this defensive network stood the grody, fortified settlements that combined natural and constructed defences. Unlike the simple wooden palisades of early medieval Europe, these were sophisticated defensive complexes. Archaeological excavations at sites like Radush Grossraden and Baron Lupchin reveal multiple layers of defences. The typical grod began with a circular or oval earthwork surrounded by a moat or wet ditch. Behind this stood a wooden palisade, often reinforced with earth and stone. The entrance was typically a narrow, winding passage that forced attackers to expose their flanks. Within this outer defence stood wooden towers and platforms from which archers could rain arrows on attackers. Their fortresses are built with such skill, wrote Adam of Bremen, that even a small number of defenders can hold off a much larger force. They dig ditches of great depth, fill them with water, and build walls of wood and earth so thick that rams and siege engines have little effect. The Wends' defensive genius extended to their use of water. Coastal settlements were positioned to control narrow inlets and river mouths, allowing Wendish ships to move freely while restricting enemy naval movements. Inland waterways were modified with submerged obstacles and movable bridges that could be quickly removed to isolate invading forces. Perhaps most fascinating was the Wends' integration of their religious practices into their defensive strategy. Sacred groves and temples were often positioned at strategically valuable locations, serving dual purposes as spiritual centres and defensive strongpoints. Attacking these sites meant not only facing determined defenders, but also risking the wrath of Slavic gods, a psychological barrier that even the most hardened Norse raiders found daunting. They claim their gods walk among them during battle, reported a Saxon chronicler. They believe that Svantevit himself will strike down any who defile his sacred places. What is most disturbing is how often their enemies meet with misfortune after attacking their temples. The legends of wolves in Wendish warfare contain elements of both truth and myth-making. Archaeological evidence confirms that the Wends did indeed keep wolves. Excavations at several settlements have uncovered wolf remains that show signs of captivity and controlled breeding. These weren't fully domesticated animals like dogs, but rather semi-tamed predators kept for specific purposes. Training likely began with cubs taken from dens and raised among humans. Selected for aggression and trainability, these wolves were conditioned to respond to specific handlers and signals. Unlike war dogs, used by other cultures to attack enemies directly, Wendish wolves served primarily as psychological weapons and sentinels. The Slavs keep wolves that obey commands like hounds, wrote a horrified Christian missionary. They use these beasts to guard their settlements, and, it is said, to hunt men in the forests. Their howling strikes terror into all who hear it, for it seems as if the forest itself has come alive with demons. In battle, wolves were typically kept on leashes by specialised handlers. Their primary purpose was intimidation. The sight and sound of snarling wolves unnerved both men and horses. During forest ambushes, wolves would be positioned downwind from approaching enemies, allowing their scent to reach the raiders' horses. The resulting panic often broke formations before combat even began. What made the Wendish defensive system truly remarkable was its adaptability. Unlike the rigid, hierarchical military structures of their enemies, Wendish defence relied on decentralised command and local initiative. Each settlement knew how to defend itself and how to coordinate with neighbours. Messages could be relayed across vast distances using signal fires, drum patterns and horn calls. This decentralised approach meant that even if invaders managed to destroy one settlement or defeat one tribal group, the overall defensive network remained intact. There was no capital to capture, no king to kill or convert that would bring the entire confederation to its knees. They have no single ruler whose death would end their resistance, complained a frustrated Saxon commander. Cut off one head, and two more rise to continue the fight. By the late 9th century, the Wends had transformed their homeland into a fortress that even the feared Vikings approached with caution. Their defensive innovations, combining natural terrain, constructed fortifications, and psychological warfare, created a system that would influence military thinking throughout the region for centuries to come. The Vikings, masters of offensive warfare, found themselves confronted with a defensive genius they could neither overcome nor fully comprehend. in the forests and marshes of Wendland, Norse military supremacy met its limit. What would have happened if the Wends hadn't resisted the Vikings? Would Scandinavia have dominated the Slavic world? Share your thoughts in the comments, especially if you have Slavic heritage. But the Wends were not content merely to defend. As Viking pressure on their territories intensified during the 9th century, they recognised that passive defence alone would not ensure their survival. Drawing on the lessons learned from Norse raiders, they developed their own offensive capabilities that would eventually carry Wendish warriors to the shores of Denmark and beyond. The transformation began with naval innovation. The Wends had always been skilled boat builders, constructing vessels suited to the rivers and coastal waters of their homeland. Now they studied captured Viking ships, adapting Norse designs to create vessels that combined Scandinavian seaworthiness with modifications suited to Wendish tactics. Archaeological discoveries at Ralsvik on Rügen Island have revealed the remains of Wendish shipyards dating to the mid-9th century. The vessels constructed there were similar to Viking longships in basic design, but featured several crucial differences. They were generally broader with shallower drafts, allowing them to navigate the shallow coastal waters and rivers of Wendish territory. Unlike Viking ships, which prioritised speed and carrying capacity for raiding, Wendish vessels emphasised stability as platforms for archers. "The ships of the Slavs are smaller than ours," wrote a Danish chronicler, "but they move with surprising speed and can enter waters too shallow for our vessels. They carry many archers whose arrows rain down like hail." Most significantly, Wendish ships featured removable rudders and centreboards that allowed them to reverse direction without turning, a crucial advantage in the narrow channels and rivers where many engagements took place. This innovation gave Wendish naval forces unprecedented manoeuvrability in confined waters. By the 860s, Wendish fleets were conducting regular raids against Danish settlements along the Baltic coast. Unlike Viking raids, which focused primarily on plunder, Wendish attacks had strategic objectives, disrupting Danish naval power, destroying shipyards, and establishing control over key trade routes. The Danish settlement of Hedeby, one of the most important trading centres in the Baltic, became a primary target. Archaeological evidence shows that the town suffered several destructive attacks during the late 9th century. Excavations have uncovered layers of ash and destruction containing Wendish arrowheads and distinctive pottery fragments, silent testimony to raids that Danish chronicles describe with horror. The Slavs came in many ships, their warriors painted for battle and howling like wolves, recounts the annals of Fulda. They burned the ships in the harbour, slew many defenders, and carried off both treasure and captives. When Danish reinforcements arrived, the Slavs had already vanished back into the mists. These raids weren't merely acts of revenge, but part of a coordinated strategy to secure control over the southern Baltic. By targeting Danish naval power, the Wends effectively created a buffer zone that protected their homeland from future Viking aggression. The island of Rügen became the centrepiece of Wendish naval strategy. Its position, jutting into the Baltic like a spearhead pointed at Denmark, made it ideal for launching raids against Scandinavian territories. The island's natural harbours could shelter hundreds of ships, while its interior provided resources for shipbuilding and provisions for raiding parties. Most importantly, Rügen housed the temple of Svantevit at Arkona, the religious centre of the Wendish Confederation. This dual role, as both military base and sacred site, gave Rügen immense symbolic and practical importance. Attacks on the island weren't merely military threats, but assaults on the spiritual heart of Wendish identity. "The island they call Rügen is the centre of all evil," wrote Adam of Bremen, reflecting Christian attitudes toward this pagan stronghold. "It is here that their most abominable worship takes place, and from here that their raids against Christian lands are launched." By the end of the 9th century, Wendish control of the southern Baltic was nearly complete. Their fleets dominated the sea lanes between Rügen and the Danish islands, while their network of coastal fortifications provided secure bases for further expansion. Viking merchants wishing to trade along the southern Baltic coast now did so under Wendish terms, paying tribute for safe passage. This naval dominance allowed the Wends to project power in ways that would have been unimaginable a century earlier. Wendish mercenaries began appearing in the armies of various European powers, bringing with them their distinctive fighting styles and equipment. Wendish traders established outposts as far away as the British Isles and the Mediterranean. But naval power was only one aspect of Wendish military expansion. On land, they developed offensive tactics specifically designed to counter the strengths of their primary enemies, the Vikings from the north and the Saxons from the west. Against Viking raiding parties, the Wends employed what modern military analysts would call swarming tactics, using their superior knowledge of local terrain to surround and isolate Norse forces. Small, highly mobile Wendish units would harass Viking raiding parties, picking off stragglers and forcing the main body to deploy defensive formations that slowed their movement. "They attack like wasps," complained a Norse account, striking quickly and then retreating into the forest. When pursued, they lead our warriors into ambushes where more of their kind wait with bows and spears. Against the more heavily armoured Saxon forces, the Wends relied on different tactics. Saxon armies typically moved slowly, burdened by supply trains and armour. The Wends exploited this lack of mobility by avoiding direct confrontation, instead targeting supply lines and isolated detachments. When forced into pitched battles, they used their superior archery to wear down Saxon forces before closing for hand-to-hand combat. Archaeological evidence from battlefield sites reveals the effectiveness of these tactics. Excavations at several 9th century conflict sites show distinctive patterns of arrow distribution, suggesting coordinated volleys designed to create gaps in enemy formations. The positioning of Wendish and Saxon remains indicates that Wendish forces typically maintained mobility throughout engagements, while their opponents were fixed in defensive positions. The weapons and armour of Wendish warriors reflected their tactical approach. Unlike their heavily armoured Saxon neighbours, or the shock-oriented Viking raiders, Wendish warriors prioritised mobility and ranged combat. Typical equipment included a composite bow, several light javelins, a single-edged sword or axe for close combat, and a small round shield. Armour was typically limited to a leather jerkin, sometimes reinforced with small metal plates, and an open helmet that didn't restrict vision or hearing. This lighter equipment allowed Wendish warriors to move quickly through difficult terrain and maintain fighting effectiveness over extended campaigns. It also meant that Wendish forces could be raised and equipped more quickly and at lower cost than their enemies' armies. "Their warriors appear lightly armed," observed a Saxon chronicler. "But do not mistake this for weakness. They move with great speed through forests and swamps where our knights cannot follow, and their arrows find the gaps in the finest mail." The true strength of Wendish offensive operations lay not in their weapons or tactics alone, but in their strategic coordination. Unlike the opportunistic raids of Viking forces or the ponderous campaigns of Saxon armies, Wendish military actions followed coherent strategic objectives, controlling key trade routes, securing buffer territories, and isolating enemy strongholds. This strategic sophistication confounded their enemies, who often failed to recognise the patterns in what seemed like random raids and skirmishes. By the time the broader strategy became apparent, the Wends had typically achieved their objectives and consolidated their gains. "They are unsettlingly organised," wrote a frustrated Danish jarl. What appears as separate raids by different tribes reveals itself in time as parts of a larger design. By the time we understand their purpose, it is too late to prevent it. The combination of naval power, innovative tactics and strategic coordination transformed the Wends from defensive survivors to regional powers. By the early 10th century, they controlled a territory stretching from the Elbe to beyond the Oder, dominated the southern Baltic sea lanes, and posed a serious threat to both Scandinavian and Saxon interests in the region. For the Vikings, who had built their reputation on terrorising coastal communities throughout Europe, the emergence of the Wends as an offensive power represented a shocking reversal. The raiders had become the raided, the predators now prey. This reversal would have profound implications for the future of Viking power in the Baltic and beyond. The Wends had not merely survived Viking aggression, they had learned from it, adapted to it, and ultimately turned it back upon its originators. In doing so, they changed the balance of power in Northern Europe and wrote a chapter of resistance that deserves greater recognition in the history of the Viking Age. At the heart of Wendish resistance to both Viking raiders and Christian missionaries lay a religious and cultural identity that provided spiritual justification for their struggle and psychological tools for prosecuting it. The Wendish religion wasn't merely a collection of beliefs, but a sophisticated system that permeated every aspect of society, including warfare. Unlike the hierarchical pantheons of their neighbours, Wendish religion centred on a complex relationship between humans, nature, and a multitude of spirits and deities. This animistic worldview saw divine presence in forests, rivers, storms, and animals, making their entire homeland sacred space, worth defending to the death. At the apex of their pantheon stood several major deities, each associated with different tribes and territories. Svantivit, the four-headed god of war and prophecy, held primacy among the Rani of Rugen. Triglav, the three-headed deity representing the unity of earth, heaven, and the underworld, was paramount among the Pomeranians. Other significant gods included Perun, thunder and justice, Jivia, life and fertility, and Velis, earth, waters, and the dead. The temple complex at Arkona on Rugen Island stood as the most important religious centre in Wendish territory. Archaeological excavations, though limited by the site's destruction during Christian conquest, have revealed a sophisticated structure, combining religious, military, and administrative functions. The temple stood atop a cliff overlooking the Baltic, surrounded by a wooden palisade reinforced with earth. Within stood a wooden building housing a massive statue of Svantivit, described by contemporary sources as over 4 metres tall, with 4 faces looking in the cardinal directions. Each face had a different expression, representing the god's ability to see past, present, and all possible futures simultaneously. The idol has 4 faces, 2 facing forward and 2 backward, wrote Saxo Grammaticus in his 12th century account. Of those that face in both directions, one looks left and the other right, so that the god may observe all quarters. Before the statue stood offerings of food, drink, and treasure. Most significant was a massive drinking horn held in the god's hand, filled with mead or wine. Each autumn, the high priest would examine the level of liquid in the horn. If it had decreased, this foretold famine in the coming year. If it remained full, abundance was expected. The temple also housed Svantivit's sacred white horse, used for divination before military campaigns. Priests would lay spears on the ground in a specific pattern, then lead the horse across them. How the animal stepped between the weapons foretold success or failure in the proposed venture. They believe this horse is ridden by the god himself when he goes to war, reported a Christian observer. Often in the morning, it appears sweaty and mud-spattered, as if returning from a great distance, though no human has mounted it. What made Arkona particularly significant was its dual role as both religious centre and military stronghold. The temple complex included barracks for a permanent guard of 300 elite warriors dedicated to Svantivit. These men formed the core of Rugen's military power, supplemented by general levies during times of war. This integration of religious and military power created a formidable psychological weapon. Wendish warriors believed they fought with divine sanction and protection, while their enemies, particularly Christians, feared they faced not merely human opponents, but the power of pagan gods. They go into battle believing their gods fight alongside them, wrote a Saxon chronicler. This makes them fearless to a degree that borders on madness. Even when greatly outnumbered, they attack as if victory is certain. Beyond the major temples, Wendish religious practice extended into everyday life and warfare through a complex system of rituals, taboos, and divination practices. Before battles, warriors underwent purification rituals, received blessings from priests, and carried talismans believed to provide protection. Captured weapons were ritually killed by bending or breaking before being offered to the gods, while portions of plunder were dedicated to temple treasuries. Most disturbing to Christian observers were Wendish sacrificial practices. While human sacrifice was relatively rare, reserved for major crises or victories, animal sacrifices were common. Particularly significant was the ritual sacrifice of captured enemy leaders, whose deaths were seen as both offerings to the gods and demonstrations of Wendish power. They select one from among their captives, usually the leader or most noble, and sacrifice him to their gods, reported a horrified missionary. The manner of this sacrifice is too terrible to describe in detail, but involves dismemberment while the victim still lives, with each part offered to different deities. The psychological impact of these religious practices on their enemies cannot be overstated. To Vikings, themselves no strangers to bloody rituals, Wendish religious practices seemed alien and terrifying. Christian missionaries and Saxon warriors faced not only the physical threat of Wendish weapons, but the spiritual dread of confronting what they perceived as active demonic forces. This psychological warfare extended to the battlefield through the use of sound, symbolism, and altered states of consciousness. Wendish warriors painted their bodies with symbols of their gods and totemic animals. Before battle, many consumed preparations of herbs and fungi that induced berserker-like states, a practice that both protected them from fear and made their behaviour in combat unpredictable and terrifying. They adorned themselves with images of their gods and beasts, observed a Danish account. Some paint their faces and bodies white like the dead, others red like blood. Before battle, they work themselves into a frenzy through dancing and drinking potions prepared by their priests. In this state, they feel no pain and fight with unnatural strength. The soundscape of Wendish warfare was carefully orchestrated to maximise psychological impact. Their battle cries mimicked animal sounds, particularly wolves and bears, while drums and horns created rhythms designed to disorient enemies and coordinate their own movements. The sudden silence that often preceded ambushes was equally calculated to heighten enemy anxiety. Perhaps most significant for their resistance to outside domination was the decentralised nature of Wendish religion. Unlike Christianity with its hierarchical priesthood and centralised authority, or even Norse paganism with its emphasis on rulers as religious figures, Wendish spiritual practices operated at multiple levels simultaneously. While major temples like Arkona held regional importance, each settlement maintained its own sacred spaces and local priests. Family units honoured household deities and ancestors independently of community rituals. This religious decentralisation mirrored and reinforced their political structure, a confederation rather than a kingdom. This decentralisation made the Wends remarkably resistant to conversion efforts. Christian missionaries found that even when they convinced a local leader to convert, his people often continued their traditional practices. Without a king whose conversion could be imposed on his subjects, Christianization required converting the Wends family by family, village by village, a nearly impossible task against determined resistance. Other pagans may be brought to Christ by converting their kings, lamented a missionary report. But among the Slavs, each man considers himself king in matters of faith. Convert one, and 100 remain steadfast in their errors. The religious dimension of Wendish resistance explains much about their effectiveness against both Viking raiders and Christian missionaries. Their warriors fought not merely for land or plunder, but in defence of a sacred landscape inhabited by their gods. Their military successes reinforced their belief in divine favour, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of resistance and religious conviction. For the Vikings, themselves motivated by a complex mixture of economic, political, and religious factors, encountering an enemy equally motivated by spiritual beliefs, but with utterly different practices, created a unique psychological challenge. Norse raiders who feared little from human opponents found themselves hesitating before the unknown spiritual powers of the Wendish forests and temples. As one Norse saga puts it, even the bravest warriors felt their courage fail when the Wendish priests began their chants and their wolves howled in answer. For it seemed the forest itself had taken their side, and what man can fight against the land itself? The religious foundations of Wendish resistance would eventually prove both their greatest strength and ultimate vulnerability. The same spiritual conviction that enabled them to resist Viking incursions would later make compromise with Christian powers difficult, ultimately leading to the Wendish Crusade. But for nearly 3 centuries, their religious practices provided the psychological framework that allowed a confederation of tribes to withstand the might of both Norse raiders and Christian kingdoms. In the clash between Viking expansion and Wendish resistance, we see not merely a military contest, but a collision between fundamentally different worldviews, each convinced of their spiritual righteousness, each willing to fight to the death for their gods and way of life. The rise of Wendish power along the southern Baltic coincided with and contributed to significant changes in Scandinavian society. As the 10th century progressed, the era of unfettered Viking raiding began to wane, replaced by more centralised kingdoms and Christianisation efforts. While many factors contributed to this transformation, the Wendish resistance played a crucial but often overlooked role. The economic impact of Wendish control over the southern Baltic trade routes struck at the heart of Viking prosperity. By the mid-10th century, the Wends effectively controlled access to the wealthy trading networks of Eastern Europe and the Byzantine Empire. Viking merchants could still participate in this trade, but now on Wendish terms, paying tolls, accepting restrictions, and operating from positions of diminished power. Archaeological evidence from trading centres like Volin, sometimes identified with the semi-legendary Jomsborg, reveals this shifting balance of power. Excavations show a transformation from a predominantly Scandinavian settlement in the 9th century to one dominated by Slavic culture by the mid-10th century, though still engaging in international trade. The material culture reflects a fusion of styles and influences, but with Wendish elements increasingly predominant. The marketplace at Volin gathers merchants from all lands, wrote Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, but it is the Slavs who set the terms of trade and collect tribute from ships entering their waters. This economic pressure coincided with and accelerated political changes within Scandinavia itself. The early Viking Age had been characterised by numerous small kingdoms and chieftainships, competing for resources and prestige. By the late 10th century, larger, more centralised kingdoms were emerging in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. These nascent states needed to establish control over their warriors and redirect their energies from independent raiding toward state-sanctioned warfare and taxation. The difficulty of raiding Wendish territories and the diminishing returns from such attempts made it easier for Scandinavian rulers to convince their warriors to accept royal authority. King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark reigned circa 958-986 exemplifies this transformation. Facing pressure from both the expanding German Empire to the south and Wendish power to the east, Harald undertook 2 initiatives that would define the post-Viking era in Scandinavia: centralisation of royal power and conversion to Christianity. The famous Jelling stones, raised by Harald around 965 CE, proclaim his achievements. Harald King ordered these monuments made in memory of Gorm, his father, and in memory of Thyra, his mother, that Harald who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. This conversion was motivated by both political calculation and genuine religious change. Christianity provided an ideological framework for centralised kingship, while alliance with the Christian German Empire offered protection against Wendish expansion. Most importantly, embracing Christianity allowed Scandinavian rulers to redirect the martial energies of their warriors toward new, church-sanctioned targets. The Wendish response to these developments was complex and pragmatic. While remaining firmly pagan, Wendish leaders recognised the shifting political landscape and adjusted their strategies accordingly. Rather than simply opposing Scandinavian kingdoms, they began forming selective alliances with them against common enemies, particularly the expanding German Empire. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests periods of cooperation between Wendish tribes and Danish forces during the late 10th century. Excavations at several border fortifications show signs of joint occupation, while chronicles mention Wendish contingents fighting alongside Danish forces against German expansion. The King of the Danes has made common cause with the Slavs, complained a German chronicler in 983 CE, providing them with ships and men to attack our eastern marches while he threatens from the north. These tactical alliances never represented true integration or cultural assimilation. The Wends maintained their distinct identity, religious practices, and territorial integrity, even while cooperating with their former enemies. When circumstances changed, they readily returned to opposition and raiding. This pattern of pragmatic alliance and opposition characterises Wendish relations with Scandinavian powers throughout the late 10th and early 11th centuries. Rather than rigid enmity, we see calculated engagement based on shifting power dynamics and immediate threats. The most dramatic example of this complex relationship was the Great Slavic Rising of 983 CE. After decades of gradual German expansion into Wendish territories, the tribes united in a massive uprising that destroyed German settlements east of the Elbe, burned churches, and drove out missionaries. This rebellion temporarily halted German eastward expansion and reshaped the political landscape of the region. What makes this uprising particularly significant is the evidence of Danish involvement. Archaeological findings and textual sources suggest that King Harald Bluetooth provided support to the Wendish rebels, seeing German expansion as a greater threat than Wendish paganism. This cooperation between a Christian Scandinavian king and pagan Slavic tribes illustrates how pragmatic political considerations often trumped religious differences. The uprising's success demonstrated that even as Scandinavia transformed into Christian kingdoms, Wendish power remained a decisive factor in Baltic politics. Their military capabilities, honed through centuries of resistance to Viking raids, now shaped the broader geopolitical landscape of Northern Europe. By the early 11th century, the relationship between Scandinavians and Wends had transformed from simple raider versus defender to a complex web of trade relationships, military alliances, cultural exchanges, and religious tensions. This complexity is reflected in the archaeological record, which shows increasing material exchange between the cultures while maintaining distinct identities. Excavations at Wendish settlements reveal increasing numbers of Scandinavian artefacts, jewellery, weapons, and household items, suggesting regular trade and possibly intermarriage. Similarly, Scandinavian sites show Wendish pottery, textiles, and decorative motifs. Yet these exchanges did not lead to cultural assimilation. Each society maintained its core identity and values. They trade with each other and sometimes fight as allies, observed a German chronicler. Yet the Slavs remained firm in their pagan ways, while the Danes embrace Christ. They are neighbours who share much, yet understand little of each other's hearts. This period also saw the emergence of mixed communities along the cultural frontier. The settlement at Hedeby Haithabu, though primarily Danish, included a significant Wendish quarter where Slavic merchants and craftspeople lived according to their own customs, while participating in the town's economic life. Similar arrangements existed at other trading centres around the Baltic. These mixed communities facilitated not only trade, but cultural and technological exchange. Wendish shipbuilding techniques influenced Scandinavian vessel design, particularly for ships intended for shallow coastal waters. Scandinavian metalworking methods were adopted by Wendish craftspeople, while Wendish agricultural practices spread to Danish settlements in marginal lands. Yet despite these exchanges and occasional alliances, fundamental tensions remained, particularly around religion. As Scandinavian kingdoms officially Christianized, pressure mounted on the Wends to abandon their traditional beliefs. Christian missionaries, now supported by the power of Scandinavian kings, intensified their efforts to convert the Slavic tribes. The Wends' response was typically pragmatic, outward accommodation when necessary, combined with determined preservation of their core beliefs and practices. Archaeological evidence from this period shows the construction of Christian churches in some border settlements, yet continued use of traditional sacred sites in the same communities. They allowed churches to be built and priests to preach, complained a frustrated missionary, yet continue their sacrifices in secret groves and consult their pagan soothsayers before making any decision of importance. This religious tension would eventually culminate in the Wendish Crusade of the 12th century, but for the transitional period of the late 10th and early 11th centuries, an uneasy coexistence prevailed. The Wends remained a powerful, independent force in the Baltic region, neither conquered by their Scandinavian neighbours, nor fully integrated into Christian Europe. For the Vikings, or rather for the Scandinavian kingdoms that evolved from Viking society, the Wendish experience represented both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge came from facing an enemy who had studied their tactics, adapted to their strengths, and developed effective countermeasures. The opportunity lay in the potential for alliance against common enemies and participation in the trade networks the Wends controlled. The transformation of Scandinavia from a land of independent raiders to organised Christian kingdoms occurred in constant dialogue with Wendish resistance and power. The Vikings did not simply evolve in isolation, but in response to the challenges posed by the peoples they encountered, none more significant than the Wends. As one Danish Jarl reportedly told his king, "We became who we are by raiding the world. The Wends became who they are by resisting us." Perhaps there is wisdom in both paths. The final chapter of Wendish independence unfolded during the 12th century, as the combined forces of Christianization and feudal expansion finally overcame centuries of successful resistance. The Wendish Crusade of 1147, though less famous than contemporaneous campaigns to the Holy Land, marked a turning point in Northern European history and the culmination of the long struggle between Slavic paganism and Christian expansion. The Crusade emerged from a complex set of motivations. Pope Eugene III, seeking to harness the martial energies of European nobility after the failure of the Second Crusade in the East, authorised campaigns against non-Christians closer to home. For Saxon nobles and the Danish kingdom, this religious sanction provided perfect cover for territorial ambitions they had harboured for generations. Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential churchmen of the era, preached the crusade with apocalyptic fervour. "We announce to you that an expedition is being prepared against the Slavs and other pagans who dwell towards the north, and we enjoin upon you, by the authority of God and in remission of sins, that you apply yourselves to this matter." The Crusader army that assembled in 1147 represented a formidable coalition. German forces under Saxon nobles marched from the west, while Danish fleets attacked from the sea. Unlike previous campaigns against the Wends, which had been primarily territorial disputes, this expedition carried the full ideological weight of medieval Christianity. The Wends were to convert or die. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals the devastating impact of the Crusade. Excavations at numerous Wendish settlements show layers of ash and destruction dating to the mid-12th century. Sacred sites were particular targets. The remains of temples and sacred groves show signs of deliberate desecration, with religious objects smashed and ritual spaces defiled. The temple at Arkona, the spiritual centre of Wendish resistance, became the primary objective of the Danish fleet, led by King Valdemar I and his advisor, Bishop Absalon. Contemporary accounts describe the siege and destruction of this site in triumphant terms that barely disguise the cultural devastation involved. Saxo Grammaticus, who may have witnessed the events, describes the fall of Arkona in 1168. When the temple was demolished, orders were given to pull down the idol of Svantivit. When this was drawn to the ground with ropes to the wonder of many, it was dragged into the Danish camp, where it became a spectacle for the curious. In the evening, it was cut up to feed the campfires, and thus the deity, who had received the worship of a deluded people, warmed the cooking pots of its enemies. The destruction of Arkona represented more than the loss of a single temple. As the religious and cultural centre of Wendish identity, its fall marked the symbolic end of organised Wendish resistance. Without their spiritual anchor, many tribes surrendered to the inevitable, accepting baptism and nominal Christian rule. Yet even in defeat, the Wendish spirit of resistance persisted. Archaeological evidence suggests that many communities maintained dual religious practices, officially Christian but secretly continuing traditional observances. Excavations at several sites have uncovered Christian churches built directly atop sacred groves, with evidence of continued pagan offerings made surreptitiously at the same locations. They come to church and receive baptism, complained a German priest in 1170, yet continue to make offerings to trees and springs when they believe no Christian eyes observe them. They speak our prayers with their lips while their hearts remain with their old gods. The political consequences of the Wendish Crusade reshaped northern Europe. Wendish territories were gradually absorbed into German principalities and the Danish kingdom. The once independent tribes became subject peoples, their lands redistributed to Christian nobles and monasteries. German colonisation intensified, bringing new settlers who transformed the demographic and linguistic character of the region. By 1200, the political entity known as Wendland had ceased to exist. The tribal confederation that had successfully resisted Viking raids and earlier Christian expansion had been fragmented, conquered, and increasingly assimilated. Yet this military and political defeat did not represent the complete erasure of Wendish culture and identity. In the centuries that followed, elements of Wendish language, customs, and folklore persisted among rural populations, particularly in remote areas. Place names throughout northeastern Germany and parts of Poland preserve Wendish origins, silent testimony to the people who once dominated the region. In some isolated communities, particularly in the Spreewald region, distinct Wendish identity, later called Sorbian, survived into the modern era. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal the sophistication and resilience of Wendish civilization. Excavations at sites like Gross Raden have uncovered evidence of advanced craftsmanship, international trade connections, and complex social organisation that challenge earlier dismissive characterisations of the Wends as primitive tribes. The material culture recovered from these sites, intricately decorated pottery, finely crafted jewellery, sophisticated weapons, speaks to a society far more developed than Christian chroniclers acknowledged. Particularly striking are the artistic representations of their deities and mythological scenes, which reveal a rich symbolic tradition that was nearly erased by Christian conquest. Their craftsmanship shows skill equal to any in Europe, noted one archaeologist studying Wendish artefacts. Their religious art in particular displays a symbolic complexity and aesthetic sophistication that contradicts the primitive pagan narrative of medieval chronicles. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Wends lies in how they shaped the societies that eventually conquered them. The military innovations developed to counter Wendish tactics influenced German and Danish military organisation for generations. Architectural elements from Wendish fortifications were incorporated into medieval castles throughout the region. Agricultural techniques adapted to the challenging soils and climate of Wendish territories became standard practice among German settlers. Even in religion, the influence persisted. Many Christian festivals and observances in the region incorporated elements of Wendish practice, thinly disguised as Christian tradition. Saints replaced pagan gods at sacred sites, while traditional seasonal celebrations were reimagined as Christian feast days. The Church found it easier to redirect their devotion than to eliminate it entirely, observed a 13th century bishop. Their attachment to sacred places and times runs too deep for simple prohibition to overcome. For the Vikings, or rather for the Scandinavian kingdoms that evolved from Viking society, the final conquest of the Wends represented a Pyrrhic victory. By the time Danish forces captured Arkona, Scandinavian society had transformed beyond recognition from the raiders who had first encountered Wendish resistance centuries earlier. The Viking Age had ended, replaced by Christian kingdoms integrated into European feudal structures. The maritime raiding culture that had defined the Norse had been channeled into state-sanctioned warfare and trade. In conquering their old enemies, the Scandinavians completed their own transformation from the very identity the Wends had first resisted. This historical irony underscores the complex relationship between these peoples. The Wends had not merely resisted Viking expansion, but had influenced its evolution. Their successful defence strategies had forced Norse leaders to develop more organised military approaches. Their control of trade routes had pushed Scandinavian societies toward more structured economic systems. Their stubborn paganism had accelerated Scandinavian Christianization as a counter-response. In the end, the story of the Wends and Vikings represents not simply conflict, but mutual transformation. Two cultures that defined themselves partly through their opposition to each other, yet ultimately influenced each other in profound and lasting ways. The forests and shores of the southern Baltic still hold many secrets of this relationship. Archaeological research continues to uncover new evidence of both conflict and connection between these peoples. What emerges is a more nuanced understanding of a crucial chapter in European history, one where the conventional narrative of Viking invincibility meets the reality of successful resistance and cultural resilience. We return to the misty Baltic forest where our story began. The ground is still damp with morning dew, the air thick with the scent of pine and salt. But now we see this landscape through different eyes, not as alien territory to be conquered, but as a homeland fiercely defended through generations of struggle. The Wends represent one of history's most successful resistance movements, a confederation of tribes that maintained their independence, culture, and religious practices against overwhelming odds for centuries. Their story challenges our conventional understanding of the Viking Age, reminding us that history is never as simple as conquerors and conquered. What made the Wendish resistance so effective was not merely military prowess, but cultural resilience. They adapted Viking tactics while maintaining their distinct identity. They engaged with international trade networks without surrendering their autonomy. They formed pragmatic alliances when necessary, without compromising their core values. This cultural resilience manifested in their decentralized political structure, a confederation rather than a kingdom. When Viking raiders or Christian missionaries managed to convert or defeat one tribal leader, others continued the resistance. There was no capital to capture, no king whose surrender would end the conflict. This distributed resilience proved remarkably effective against hierarchical opponents. Their religious practices reinforced this resilience by sacralizing the landscape itself. Every forest grove, river, and hill had spiritual significance, creating a homeland worth defending to the death. Their gods were not distant figures, but present forces embodied in the natural world around them. This religious worldview made compromise with Christian missionaries nearly impossible. Surrender meant not just political subjugation, but spiritual devastation. The archaeological record continues to reveal the sophistication of Wendish society. Their settlements were not primitive villages, but complex centres combining defensive, religious, and economic functions. Their craftsmanship, in pottery, metalwork, textiles, and wood carving, demonstrates technical skill and artistic sensibility equal to their contemporaries. Their trade networks extended from the Baltic to the Mediterranean and beyond. Yet despite their historical significance, the Wends remain largely absent from popular understanding of medieval Europe. Their story has been marginalised in histories written by their conquerors, their achievements minimised or erased. Only in recent decades have archaeological discoveries and scholarly reassessment begun to restore their rightful place in European history. This historical erasure reflects the ultimate tragedy of the Wendish experience. they successfully resisted Viking raids and early Christian expansion, maintaining their independence for centuries. Yet their very success made them targets for the concentrated power of feudal Europe. The Wendish Crusade brought against them the full military and ideological might of medieval Christendom, a force that eventually overwhelmed even their remarkable resilience. The physical traces of Wendish civilization, their temples, fortresses, and settlements, were systematically destroyed or repurposed by their conquerors. Their written records, if they existed, have not survived. Their religious traditions were suppressed, their language gradually replaced by German and Danish. What remains are archaeological fragments, place names, and accounts written by their enemies. Yet something of the Wendish spirit persisted. In remote forests and marshlands, elements of their culture and identity survived for generations. Their descendants, particularly the modern Sorbs, maintain distinctive traditions that echo their ancient heritage. Their resistance to assimilation continues to inspire those who value cultural diversity and indigenous rights. For the Vikings, the Wendish experience represented a crucial challenge to their expansion and a catalyst for their transformation. The raiders who had terrorized Europe's coastlines met in the Wends, an opponent who studied their tactics, adapted to their strengths, and developed effective countermeasures. This resistance contributed to the evolution of Scandinavian society from decentralized raiding cultures to organized Christian kingdoms. The historical relationship between Vikings and Wends reminds us that cultural exchange occurs even, perhaps especially, in contexts of conflict. Each society borrowed from the other, adapted to the other's challenges, and ultimately transformed in response to their ongoing interaction. What began as simple raider versus defender evolved into a complex web of trade, alliance, religious tension, and mutual influence. Perhaps the most important lesson of the Wendish story is the power of cultural resilience in the face of seemingly overwhelming force. For centuries, this confederation of tribes maintained their independence and identity against the dual threats of Viking raiders and Christian expansion. Their eventual defeat came not from any inherent weakness, but from the concentrated might of a crusade specifically targeted at their destruction. As we leave the misty Baltic forest where our story began, we carry with us a deeper understanding of this forgotten chapter in European history. The Wends may have been conquered, their temples destroyed, their gods officially abandoned. But their legacy lives on in the landscape they defended, in the archaeological discoveries that continue to reveal their achievements, and in our growing recognition of their historical significance. Perhaps the most terrifying enemy is not the one you fight, but the one who survives without you ever truly understanding them. The Wends remain in many ways that enigmatic opponent, a people who successfully resisted Viking power for centuries, yet remained shadowy figures in our historical consciousness. As archaeology continues to uncover their story, we gain not just knowledge of a forgotten people, but insight into the complex interactions that shaped medieval Europe. The forests of the southern Baltic still hold many secrets. In the play of mist among ancient trees, in the whisper of waves along the shore, echoes of the Wendish past remain for those who listen. Their story, of resistance, resilience, and ultimate transformation, deserves to be remembered not as a footnote to Viking history, but as a crucial chapter in the making of Europe. Did you know about the Wends before this? Which part shocked you most? Let us know. Your insights shape what we explore next. Leave a comment below. What other forgotten peoples deserve to be remembered? And how many more ghosts still haunt Viking memory?